Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome back to the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm Shane Rosenthal. And on this special Easter edition of the program, I'll be featuring an interview I recorded with Dr. Lydia McGrew about resolving differences in the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. Dr. McGrew is the author of a number of helpful books, chief among them being Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. In her most recent book, Testimonies to the Truth, Dr. McGrew writes that, quote, "The Gospels present themselves as truthful historical records of the life and teaching of Jesus. There are 4 of them. They all have differences. Some stories are told in multiple Gospels, some only in one Gospel. Sometimes the different Gospel stories of the same events will tell different details. Sometimes they might even seem to contradict each other, though often these claimed contradictions are drummed up by critics and skeptics and are unimpressive when we look at them rigorously. These variations can be a good thing. Like witness statements about a bank robbery, gospel accounts that contain differences give us different perspectives and additional facts. The fact that they aren't exactly the same gives us reason to think that they haven't simply been copied from one another or from a common source. Just as we would expect if they really were written by 4 different people who all had their own access to the facts, we often find that they complement one another. The differences in the accounts are often fruitful, fitting together in incidental interlockings that point to truth." End quote. Those incidental interlockings that point to truth, Dr. McGrew calls undesigned coincidences, which she's written about in a number of her writing projects. When I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. McGrew about some of the differences in the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection, I first asked her to give an example or two of undesigned coincidences in the Gospels.
There are a couple of them that come up in connection with Jesus' appearance before Pilate. If you just read Luke, Pilate comes back and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Because a charge of sedition has been brought against Jesus. And Jesus says, "You've said it. You say that I am." Now, I actually think that that is an idiom that means yes. And in Luke's gospel, Pilate goes back out and he says to the people, "I find no fault in this man." This is very confusing because as the Roman governor, Pilate needed to take very seriously something where someone was claiming to be a king, a Jewish king, because that could be an attempt to start an uprising. So it's mysterious in Luke as to why he dismisses that. But John has more information about their conversation, and that at this point Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so then you get the idea that Pilate probably thought that he was something of a harmless religious crank. So this appears to mean that John had access to somebody, or possibly even was allowed to be present himself, when this conversation took place, that knew more details of this conversation between Jesus and Pilate, and it fits together with Luke like 2 pieces of a puzzle. And he goes right on there. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and he says, if it were, my servants would fight. And that's an undesigned coincidence in the other direction, because here we have a question that's raised by John's gospel that's answered by Luke. So in the first one I mentioned, we have a question raised by Luke's gospel that's answered in John. Now here, you might wonder, why does Jesus say this? Because John does record that Peter cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. So Jesus is taking quite a risk by saying, my servants would fight. All that they have to do is tell Pilate, yeah, and they fought when we captured him. Pilate's going to say, yeah, they did fight.
Yeah, you could imagine Pilate saying, but what about this guy named Malchus?
With his ear gone, exactly. But if you go over to Luke, it actually says that Jesus healed his ear.
Which means that they probably wouldn't have brought him in as evidence, because it's like, well, it's either you're lying to us or he is a kind of a miraculous healer.
Right, which would make Pilate all the more superstitious as a Roman. So absolutely, Jesus knew he was perfectly safe in bringing this up because his own peaceful intentions were very evident from his miracle that he had just recently performed.
And your point then is that the fact that John presents this material without explanation shows that there's a larger story that's at play here, and it's not just that he's copying other gospels, right?
Or making it up. Or inventing
or making it up.
This is what we get when we have oral history. In oral history, people tell things that are salient to them. Salient meaning stand out in their minds. And they don't always explain everything. If you talk to someone about his memories of the war or something like that, World War II, the Gulf War, whatever it might be, he'll say things, and you might have to ask him further questions to figure out how it all fits together.
Which is what we're going to get into when we talk about harmonizing the accounts of the resurrection. Sometimes it is difficult, but the reason you're saying it's difficult is because it's real history.
Absolutely. Exactly. So this is the way people talk in this kind of unpremeditated way. And sometimes they accidentally raise questions that they don't answer. And I think that's how John is talking and how John is writing from his own memories and knowledge.
All right, let's talk about the resurrection. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, John Calvin writes, as the resurrection is the most important article of our faith, and without it, the hope of eternal life is extinguished. For this reason, the evangelists are the more careful to prove it, as John here collects many proofs in order to assure us that Christ is risen from the dead. I was actually surprised that Calvin says there that the resurrection is the most important article of our faith. Do you think that he's right on that point? Do you think he's right to call the resurrection the most important article of the Christian faith, and if so, why?
I would instead like to say it's the central piece of evidence for the Christian faith. I don't generally like to get involved in creating competitions between important articles of the Christian faith. So is the incarnation more important versus the resurrection?
Yeah.
But evidentially speaking, the resurrection is the evidence of the incarnation. It's the central evidential miracle. And so that's how I would put it. I would put it in epistemic terms.
Interesting. Yeah, so I kind of think that Calvin has some merit in that 1 Corinthians 15 comes to mind when Paul talks there about the things of first importance. But it's not the resurrection detached from the other parts of the gospel. He talks about the gospel as the death, burial, and resurrection.
Correct.
Which was witnessed both in advance by the prophets and the scriptures and in time by various witnesses that he goes on to cite. So for me, it's a part of that thing of first importance. Mm-hmm. This is a doctrine that is at the heart of things that are most important. You would agree with that, though, right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so though it is one of those crucial articles of faith that is at the heart of the Christian gospel, it isn't really easy to harmonize the various accounts of the resurrection, though, is it?
Well, I think that the independence of the accounts is very evident in the fact that they are different. And I also think that scholars have made a big deal about alleged discrepancies, some of which are more of a problem than others, and people are worried by that. If I may put it this way, they lose their nerve. Someone who is a welcome alternative here is John Wenham, and I highly recommend his book, Easter Enigma. Mm-hmm. It has influenced me. I don't agree with every single harmonization he gives there, but it's quite a good book, and it's what I would call a proof of concept for harmonizing the Easter narratives. And Wenham is a very learned guy. The late John Wenham, he is no longer with us, but this book is from the early 90s, if I recall, where he just goes through and shows at least one way that one can harmonize all the resurrection accounts. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do.
Well, so let's get into the account of the resurrection here from John's angle. So in verses 1 and 2 of John 20, we read that on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, and she saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So Mary ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So first of all, when you read these first two verses from John's version of the story, it seems like there are different people who are being mentioned. John's account here only mentions Mary Magdalene, but Matthew says it was Mary Magdalene and another Mary, whereas Mark says it's Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James. And Luke's version, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Joanna, and other women. So how do you think we should explain differences of these kinds, Lydia?
Well, the nice thing about those is that they're not even discrepancies at all. They're just differences. There's a principle in the law of evidence in court, and this goes all the way back to the English common law, that says affirming that one person was involved does not mean denying that another person was involved. That's just the way that people talk. It's not an attempt to give the impression that that's the only person who was present. It's just mentioning one person and not mentioning someone else. And so that's really important here, that this is all completely compatible, that these are just the witnesses that were salient, that stood out to particular gospel authors.
And so the important thing to take home is that just because a person mentions one individual as a witness doesn't mean there weren't others. The contradiction would be there if a person said that Mary was there and only Mary.
Exactly, yes.
Now, you do point out somewhere in your writings, don't you, that Mary's statement in verse 2 of John 20 is illuminating in that she tells the disciples that they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb and we do not know where they have laid him. Why do you think that's significant?
It shows that at some point Mary Magdalene was discussing this with some other women who were with her at the tomb. Now, I don't think they're with her at that moment. I think she ran back alone, but she's talking about this consultation that she had with the other women. So it's this very oblique allusion to the presence of other women, which is very nice because it really shows John's knowledge of what Mary Magdalene probably really did say to Peter and John.
Yeah, because Mary's the only one who's reported there, but there does seem to be something in her language that shows she wasn't the only one who was there.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, there are some difficulties here, though, in the first two verses of John 20 that are perhaps somewhat difficult to sync up with the synoptic accounts. For example, in Matthew's version, we're told that there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. And this angel tells the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come and see the place where he lay, then go and quickly tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee." So they departed and ran quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell the disciples. This does not seem to square initially with John's account, for as we've seen in his version, Mary simply finds the tomb empty with the stone rolled away, and then runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple that someone has taken the Lord, and we don't know where they have laid him. In other words, in my reading of that, she seems distraught about Jesus' missing body, but she says nothing to Peter and John about the angelic announcement or the fact that he'd actually been raised from the dead. So how do you end up reconciling these differences in the narratives?
Right. Well, definitely Mary Magdalene is still distraught. She's distraught in John's narrative until she actually sees Jesus in the end. So the first thing I think we need to say here is that the women did not actually see the angel roll back the stone. John Wenham has noted that the Greeks would often use a simple past tense. There was an earthquake. An angel rolled back the stone. An angel sat on it. But where they mean what we English people call a pluperfect, there had been a great earthquake. The angel had rolled back the stone and so forth. I don't think the women saw that at all.
Right.
Matthew narrates it, and you might think from reading his narrative the women saw it, but I think he learned it from somebody else.
Yeah.
So let's just start there. I don't think the women saw that. So Mary Magdalene has not seen any angels at the time when she speaks to Peter and John, and I think we can figure that out from reading John's gospel. So then I think you can coordinate them just by seeing that Mary Magdalene just did not stay with the other women. Sometimes New Testament scholars imply that people are all chained together. It's almost like they're looking at it as a statue or something. It's all stone, and if they start together, they have to stay together. So that's not true. I think she saw it. Maybe she peeked in, saw the stone was rolled away, maybe peeked in briefly, saw that you couldn't see the body. They consulted for a minute. What happened? Maybe somebody took the body. I'm going to go tell Peter and John. Maybe they can talk to Joseph of Arimathea. And off she runs.
Exactly.
And then the other women, I think, said something to the effect, let's see what's going on here a little more. And they go inside, and then they see the angels inside. So what's great about this is we don't have to have anybody switching the order of anything here. John is just following Mary Magdalene completely in order. And you can think of the camera in Matthew and Mark and Luke just following the other women completely in order as to what happened. And it's a very economical harmonization, and I think it really explains everything.
Yeah, that's basically the way I read this as well. I kind of see it as multiple waves of women arriving at the tomb, perhaps not all at the same time. And Mary may be the one who arrives first. Mary may be with others. And as you say, she sees that the stone has been rolled away and that no one is there. No guards are at the tomb. And she simply runs away and goes to tell the other disciples. But others are arriving. So what Matthew and Mark and Luke are reporting is this sort of condensed narrative that's not reporting all this chaos that's happening with multiple waves of women and all the different events that are going on. And in that respect, it's hard to put these things together, but that's probably the best explanation.
I don't necessarily think they arrive separately. I don't think we have to have that going on. For one thing, she has to be with some other women in order to consult with them, as we already discussed, where she says, we do not know where they have laid him. They presumably said to one another, oh my goodness, if they took him, where did they lay him? So there have to be some other women that she's chatting with for a second there, at least before she runs off. So in that sense, they could have all arrived at the same time.
But would you say it's possible that one of the differences between the synoptics and John's version is to see that the synoptics are compressed versions that are just intending to give us the gist of the account? For example, one way of looking at the end of Luke 24 is to see that it's highly compressed. You don't know that it's compressed until you look at the beginning of the book of Acts. In fact, when you look at Luke 24, it almost looks like Jesus ascends to heaven that same day of his resurrection until you see in Acts chapter 1, oh wait, he has now unpacked this a little bit more. We see there's a longer period. In the same way, we could see maybe that there is a lot of chaos and fluidity of what kind we don't know, but the synoptic version of the story is condensed, and whether or not there are some women who are arriving and some leaving, that's just not reported. It's all reported as this one event that in reality was a little bit more complicated.
I definitely think that Matthew leaves out the fact that Mary left. Whether he knew that she left or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I would definitely agree he does not mention that aspect of what you call chaos. As far as the end of Luke 24, I actually think I have a big discussion of this in The Mirror of the Mask. I think when we read Luke 24 carefully, he puts in enough notes of time that you can see that it couldn't all possibly fit on that day. It would have been too dark for them to even see Jesus ascend. So Luke might very accidentally, to a reader who doesn't read carefully, give the impression that it all happened on one day, but not that he is really putting everything on one day.
Yes.
Unfortunately, some authors who use the word compression, they actually believe, and I believe at this point William Lane Craig believes this and has said this in public, and so does Dr. Lacona. They believe that Luke puts all of the events on Easter Sunday, and I disagree
that it's intentional?
with that it is intentional.
Wow.
Correct.
I guess the reason why that sort of careful reading becomes important is when this is denied as being historical. So there are a lot of people who can take some of the differences for granted until people start questioning, wait, is this real history? So then you need to take a look at what is being presented as eyewitness testimony, the way, a police reporter would. And you need to say, can these things be harmonized? Can we look at this carefully and see, are there really contradictions that are happening here?
Yes, definitely.
Now, in one of your writings, you quote a man by the name of Thomas Starkie, who in 1833 wrote an essay called The Practical Treatise of the Law and Evidence. And he says in your quote, "It has been well remarked by a great observer that the usual character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. It so rarely happens that witnesses of the same transaction perfectly and entirely agree in all points connected with it, that an entire and complete coincidence in every particular engenders suspicion." This is precisely the sort of thing that we're finding here as we look at the differences between the resurrection accounts, isn't it?
Yes, they give evidence of being independent in a very fruitful and relevant sense, independent in the way that you find eyewitnesses being independent. And that's important. This isn't just independent imaginations or independent embellishments or something. This is actually independent accounts from people who are knowledgeable about what happened.
Right. So in my view, Matthew does mention Mary Magdalene, but it does say that she was one of the first women who went to the tomb, but it doesn't say she is the one that saw the angel outside. So I would say he is highly condensing the material of a lot of different things that happened that day. And so if you just allow that she is one of the witnesses who arrives at the tomb, but he doesn't tell the information that she left and then other witnesses saw the angel, then I think the problem is solved.
I think we're really quite close together. It's just a question of whether the angel was inside or outside, and as you say, Matthew just uses the word they at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the point isn't to exactly figure it out. It could be that both you and I don't have it exactly right, and then another explanation ends up being true. The point is these are harmonizable.
Exactly. And that's Wenham's point also.
So a few years ago, I was watching with my daughter one of those PBS or History Channel documentaries about the life of Jesus. And a number of the scholars were making the claim that Mark's gospel is actually the earliest of all the gospels. And that when you take a look at the oldest copies of this gospel, they don't actually include the longer ending in which Jesus rises from the dead. And since that entire section is a much later addition, these scholars on this program were saying that this means that Mark's gospel didn't actually promote the idea of Jesus' resurrection. And since it was the earliest of the gospels, the resurrection must therefore have been a later invention. So how do you, Lydia, typically respond to that sort of approach? And secondly, what's your position concerning the long ending of Mark?
Well, I think we definitely need to reject the idea that the shortest gospel includes the most that we can say. This idea of the shortest gospel is like a little seed, and then it grows from there by people embellishing it or that kind of thing, or like it's the little prehistoric horse, and that it evolves from there and gets bigger and bigger as people add to it in a non-factual way. I think that's definitely not supported. My work on undesigned coincidences shows that when other later written gospels have material that is not in Mark, it's often confirmed, and it often dovetails very beautifully with what is in Mark. So it would definitely be question-begging and incorrect to assume that everything started with Mark and anything that's not in Mark, must be made up. As far as the long ending of Mark, it begins with verse 9. It's not in our oldest manuscripts. That's correct. It is quite ancient. It looks like it was known in the 2nd century, so that's pretty ancient. In verses 1 through 8, it does include the empty tomb and the announcement to the women.
Yeah, and verses 1 through 8 is part of the shorter version. So what you're saying is the section we do have does mention the resurrection.
Yes, it definitely does. And it breaks off. I think it breaks off mid-sentence. This is a great controversy among scholars, but I actually think that the original ending of Mark was lost, and then that someone perhaps around the end of the 1st century, someone I think who had John actually, and probably all of the other Gospels, wrote a sort of a summary of the appearance accounts and put it on there because it just felt so incomplete. And as I say, probably around the end of the 1st century.
That's exactly the position I arrived at myself. So we're on the same page there. I think maybe, you have these old scrolls and a section of it fell off. And what I'm hoping is that someday we can discover another version of Mark that has that longer ending that's the original long ending.
That would be great. Yeah. And so great minds think alike.
Now, in Luke 24, verses 9 and following, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, leave the tomb in order to report the angelic announcement to the apostles. But their words were dismissed by most of the disciples as an idle tale. Peter, however, rose and ran to the tomb, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. That last part of Luke's account seems to fit really nicely with the flow of John's narrative, doesn't it?
Yes, Peter, especially when you think of that, however, as this logical however. Everybody else is making fun of them, but Peter at least goes to look.
Yeah, but there is an important difference because in John's version of the story, Peter runs to the tomb with the beloved disciple. Why do you think Luke leaves that important detail out?
For one thing, we have to be really careful not to really get too caught up in trying to figure out why somebody leaves something out. I think a lot of times we just don't know. For example, we just don't know why Luke leaves out all the appearances to the women. We just don't know why Matthew leaves out all the appearances to the men in Jerusalem. So there's all kinds of things that we could wish that they wouldn't leave out, and we don't know why they do. The other thing is we do have indications that Luke is very specially connected to Peter. There are things in Luke that are unique to Luke, special about Peter, like the great catch of fish in Luke 5, that are found in no other Gospels. So I think there's definitely evidence that Luke probably interviewed Peter personally and had personal access to him independent of Mark and is very interested in Peter. So that's just one possible thing. But beyond that, I don't think we can always give any really good explanation for why somebody leaves something out.
All right, so now let's continue to make our way here through John 20 as we pick up with verse 3. So Peter goes out with the other disciple, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping in to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. And then Simon Peter came and following him went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Why do you think the narrator makes such a big deal about the linen cloths and even the way that the face cloth is folded up? What's the point he's making there?
Well, I think we definitely have a very vivid visual imagination. I think what it shows is that the body was not stolen. There was an author named Latham. He wrote around the beginning of the 1900s. He has a whole little disquisition, one of those old things that's out of copyright now, about the grave clothes and the way they were lying. It's a wonderful little booklet. Thieves would definitely not be folding up the face cloth. They would not be taking off the wrappings. They'd just be carrying it off. And I actually think the spices were sticky. I think they were sticky, heavy spices that were slathered in between the windings. And in that case, it would be very difficult to get them off. But no thieves are going to pause and unwind and leave them. And if they do, it's, they're not going to fold up the face cloth. So it's really clear that this was something miraculous that happened. I see that passage as illustrating realism in narrative. This is something Leon Morris says. It's the way it's detailed that first the beloved disciple outruns Peter, and then he doesn't go in, he hesitates. Peter comes in very much in keeping with his personality. He just goes straight in. He doesn't hesitate for a moment. And the beloved disciple kind of looks and he sees the cloths lying there, and then he ponders on this and he believes. That's just very realistic. In fact, if you tried to give the different parts of that running, then hesitating, then Peter goes in, then he goes in, sees, and so forth, a symbolic meaning in terms of comparing them, it would get very speculative and very strained. So what it seems to me to reflect instead is that vividness and realism of narrative.
So now as we continue on in the narrative of John chapter 20, in verse 11 and following, we see that the beloved disciple and Peter leave, and then Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Lydia, isn't it astonishing that this relatively obscure person, Mary Magdalene, should be the first one to encounter Jesus after he's risen again from the dead?
Or even any of the other women, whether it's she is the first or whether the encounter described in Matthew is the first. Either way, women were pretty obscure anyway in that culture, and it is, and I think that this does meet something that's sometimes called embarrassment, that this is not something that anybody would make up. And she was a woman out of whom 7 devils had been cast, according to Luke's gospel. So this is not a prestigious person in any other way.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought Matthew's gospel had the angelic announcement, but not Jesus appearing.
No, he appears to the women on the road.
Oh, that's right.
Matthew 28, verses 8 and 9. Jesus appears to them on the road when they are running to tell the other disciples.
Okay, so that could be part of the chaos that we don't know when that is in terms of the larger sequence that you had to put John's narrative in.
Exactly. So, you'll notice that the author of the long ending of Mark says appears first to Mary Magdalene. He obviously thinks that happened before he appeared to the other women. And you could take that either way because Jesus could move real fast at this point. Let's put it that way. He can appear to them on the road while Mary Magdalene is talking to Peter and John back at their apartment, as it were, and then appear to Mary Magdalene when she's weeping outside the tomb. Or he can appear to her, and then maybe Wenham thinks they were going to tell a different group of disciples who were staying somewhere farther away. So they've got like a longer way to go, and then he appears to them at that point.
Now, do you agree with those who argue that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is essentially citing an early Christian creed when he says, I've delivered to you of first importance that which I've received, that Christ died for our sins, rose again, seen by witnesses. Do you think that that's an early Christian creed?
In one sense, yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously condensed. It's a condensed version. It may have been something that they taught to people. I don't necessarily think that it's got any priority over the gospel accounts. Some people would emphasize it as somehow being, more reliable or earlier or something, but I do think it's a condensed version that may have been taught to catechumens, for example, when preparing them for baptism or for entry into the Christian body.
Now, if that's the case, though, if it was an early Christian creed, some scholars, even liberal scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Reza Aslan, argue that it goes to the mid-30s. If that's really the case, if it's an early creed for catechumens, why do you think that it only mentions the male disciples and not some of the female disciples like Mary Magdalene?
Well, I think that they would want something that would be forceful for their catechumens from all different cultures. And in Jewish law, women's testimony counted for less than men's did. Greek, Roman culture, none of them had, I'm sorry to say, a very high view of the value of female testimony. And so it would make sense that if you're going to boil it down, you're going to teach it to people, you're going to boil it down to the more prestigious disciples.
Yeah, and if you actually look at that account from 1 Corinthians 15, it doesn't actually say that he appears first to Peter and then to the 12. And in other words, it's not giving us an exhaustive account of what happened.
Yeah, it makes no claim to be exhaustive. Notice, too, that it includes James. And the appearance to James is not mentioned anywhere in the Gospels. But James was a prominent, James, this would be the brother of Jesus. This is not James, the son of Zebedee. James, the brother of Jesus, was a prominent leader in the early church. So it's very obvious that that little creed, if you want to call it that, is listed for people for whom this is going to be salient, this is going to be important. They've heard of James, the brother of Jesus. So that's why it bothers to list him, because he's very much revered, actually, especially by the Jewish members of the early church.
And what's more is he is, if you look at this gospel and also Mark's gospel, it says clearly that Jesus' brothers did not believe that he was in fact the Messiah. And one of the accounts actually says they thought him to be insane.
That's true.
So something has to account for that change of faith. And this is also not something we only know about from the Epistle of James or here from 1 Corinthians. Josephus actually talks about this. The one passage that's uncontested from Josephus is that the brother of Jesus, called the Christ, was martyred. So there is here a mention of Jesus being the one they call the Christ, but secondarily, that his brother was one of the leaders of the early church and who believed that he was the Messiah. So something has to account for all this.
Right. And that's also, Eusebius preserves a detailed account of the martyrdom of James, which he preserves from an earlier writer named Hegesippus, because it was during a time when they didn't have a procurator and things were a little chaotic, and they actually threw him down from a high building, and then they came and stoned him and so forth. And they actually got in trouble for that because they weren't supposed to be killing people on their own.
That's exactly right. That's what Josephus says as well. All right. So now, after appearing to Mary, Jesus at some point appears to Peter, and then to two men on the road to Emmaus, and then to all the 12 except for Thomas, and then 8 days later to all the apostles, including Thomas. And then there are some questions about the geography, which we don't need to get into, but Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:6 that over 500 of the brothers saw him at one time. And so the question I have for you is, where do you think we should place that by comparing this claim with the gospel material?
Yeah, I would definitely put that in Galilee. So I'm just going to wade right into that geographical question. They were obviously in Jerusalem for at least 8 days, which would fit with the feast that they were celebrating. As you know, Jews would not generally leave before the end of the feast. And John makes it clear that there were two appearances to the male disciples that occurred in Jerusalem, one without Thomas and then one with Thomas 8 days later. And then after that, they went to Galilee, and that is recounted in Matthew. Now, Matthew only mentions the 11 going to Galilee. But once again, as we discussed earlier, mentioning one group does not mean denying that others were also present. Yeah. So I believe that in Galilee, when they met, it actually says in Matthew, they went to the mountain that Jesus had appointed for them.
Right.
And that's very interesting. When had Jesus appointed this? Well, I suppose he could have done it before he even died, but it could have been when he saw them in Jerusalem that he arranged this meeting. And that would also fit with his telling the women and the angels telling the women to tell my brethren. That doesn't just have to be the 11. That can be the larger group of his followers, that I'm going before them into Galilee. They had to arrange it. And they didn't have a stadium in Jerusalem or something, but outdoors in Galilee in the hills, there'd be plenty of room for them to meet and to see Jesus. So,
such as the place of the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if the number of the group of extended disciples was something like 70, if Jesus says, go and tell the other disciples, they're not going to keep this to themselves. They're going to head to Galilee with their family, and then that could easily turn into, a week later, 500 people or more.
Yes, that actually makes a lot of sense. We also know that he appeared a little earlier than that, because John expressly says it was the third time at the Sea of Galilee, as recounted in John 21. That's to 7 of his disciples on that occasion. So I think the appearance to the 500 was a little bit later than that. But what's nice about that is that John has appearances both in Jerusalem and in Galilee. He makes it clear that they go back to Galilee. So even geographically, John sort of ties in with the synoptics there.
Well, folks, thanks for joining me for this Easter edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. If you happen to be listening to this program on Easter Sunday, I was recently invited as a guest on the Elisa Childers podcast, and that episode will be released later this afternoon. If you'd like to watch or listen to that conversation, I'll provide a link at humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com, and I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.